Well, hello everyone. It's so nice to see many of you actually join today. My name is Haesun, and I will be actually leading this webinar for all of us for next little while. So my name is spelled Haesun, and it's pronounced as saying hey to sun. So that's what it is. And today's topic is a very intriguing one for me, as well as many of you actually will find this very useful and also usable. um, and let me see how many of you are joining here. And I just loved many, many questions that you were asking. Actually, at the time when you were signing up, we asked you a question about what questions do you have about this topic? And so many of you actually responded to that. And what was so interesting was that some of your questions were very practical, such as, how do I have a better conversation with my family? Especially, how do I listen to my parents better? How do I listen to my kids better? Because I'm the one who's talking a lot because they're not really talking. And then other people actually have mentioned, how do I speak to my spouse about certain things? And how do we actually talk to our friends or our colleagues? And actually, one person mentioned that, why is it so difficult sometimes to actually listen to some of your friends talk? So I love some of those practical questions. And I think some others actually have asked really intriguing question about actual physical part of listening. Someone said, well, I'm actually experiencing a hearing loss, and it's getting harder and harder to actually hear or listen to people. So then it really creates a lot of conditions for people, including myself and other people, to actually, listening is physically becoming difficult, which is very fascinating. So we're going to have a few things about some of these questions that you have asked, and we're going to get into how do we actually listen so that people will start to talk. And as you can see, you can use the chat function to communicate with other people on this chat as well as myself. And if you have questions, please use the question and answer so that we can actually I can respond to you as well. So today's topic, let me see if I can. It's always a little, what do you call it? Adventure to find the screen that you're trying to share. So let me see. I actually made a, do you see this? Can you see this?
Yep, we're all good.
All right. I just thought I'm going to put in this picture of a dog that looks like a Russell Terrier. So let me tell you a couple things about me so that you can sort of position me where I am. Well, this is my home office in Toronto, and I live in Toronto with my family. And I live in a multi-generational home and multicultural home almost, because my mom is the first generation immigrant here. I grew up here, but then I am fully bilingual in both Korean and English. And I have my nephews who live here too. And because my sister is in a sort of exposed workplace. So now the kids are living with me during the duration of COVID. So I have 11-year-old and 14-year-old nephews living with me here, and they do not speak any Korean. So it's sort of very interesting sort of place that I live. And that also includes a Russell Terrier. It's not a Jack Russell, but it's a Parsons Russell Terrier. I don't know how many of you actually have Russell Terriers at your home, but it's just so much joy, and also it's kind of hellish at times. But one of the things that I really love about Russell Terrier is actually they do that with their ear. Sometimes one ear pops up, and I thought there's an illusion that they're actually listening to you. So today is better conversation and how to listen so that people will talk. So I hope that you will be actually engaging in this conversation because you have a good reason to sign up for something like this. So, whatever you're doing, you might be doing the dishes, you might be preparing for, lunch or so on. But if you have pen and paper nearby, could you please write down like the name of a person that you would consider like a good listener, somebody that you have experienced in your life. Oh man, that person is such a good listener. Okay. For me, it's Paul. You don't have to know any more than that, right? So Paul, I know who that is. So please write down that name, somebody that you would consider, wow, that person knows how to listen. And then the second person is this. As you think about people that you have in your life, you're like, oh man, I wish I can have this person to actually talk more to me so we can actually have a conversation. And actually a few people mentioned about their children not talking to them, so they end up talking and questioning and all these things, especially if you have teenagers living with you, like, hello, here I am. And it's funny because increasingly the older one is becoming, in his responses to me, he seems to use the word nothing quite a bit. So, I mean, he will be actually opening the fridge and he just closes it. I mean, my fridge is full of fresh ingredients. And then I'm like, so what do you want to eat? He's like, nothing. It's like, okay, great. Or, when he is actually going outside and he's like, he's not dressed warm enough. I'm like, hey, are you going to go out like that? And he's like, well, there's nothing to wear. I mean, it's full, your closet is full of stuff. Or stuff like, he looks certain ways. I want to talk to him and, do you want to chat about something? He's like, I don't know. So if you have a teenager, living with you, you probably know what I mean by somebody that you would like to have more conversations with. And who's that person? So please write down your name, write down their name so that you can actually think about them as we actually go along. So, as I mentioned, many of you actually asked such brilliant questions. And what I love about doing this webinar is it's a conversation that we have. And, earlier I mentioned that I live with two nephews, a dog, and my mom. And there is so much more than just living with three other people and a dog. So if you can imagine, this is a multi-generation home. And during COVID times, I've lost my dad. And that means I have a grieving mother and I am grieving and the kids are here. So in that context, you can imagine what kind of conversations are happening in this household or at this address. And the fascinating thing about words is that you can actually trace the word to see what it used to mean. And it's fascinating. For example, we call this series Better Conversation. And the conversation, the word conversation actually used to mean your address. And it's not that far off because you do live in many conversations. I feel like I'm living in constant conversations with people that I live with and also with myself. So it really is my address where I actually live. So thinking about many conversations you are having or happening at your address, think about which ones that would you like to hold better and which ones that you would like to somehow increase or decrease. So what happens is often when I ask this question, people say, hey, I really wish I can have this conversation better. I wish I said this. I wish I didn't say this. I wish they would say this. I wish they wouldn't say this to me. So lots of times we talk about what we say rather than what we listened for. So today will be all about listening. And as I said, many of you asked practical questions, even physical questions, and a couple of you actually asked very philosophical questions that made me think for days. So let me give you one example. I think Christopher, I'm not going to say the last name, but Christopher, among all of you joining, Christopher posed this question. What happened to us that, along the line, somehow humans lost the skills of listening to each other? What happened? Like, that's such a philosophical question. I don't know what happened, but then it made me think. So then I thought about, yeah, what's happening? Why is this happening? And one thing I thought about it was maybe because we live in this culture of you need to know how to speak up. So people are trying to speak up, and there's a lot of media that actually encourages you speaking up. Then do we have now less room for listening because we're busy speaking? That's one thought. Another thought was maybe because information out there is so vast. So we have this increased needs for bottom lining things. Can you tell me in summary? So, I mean, actually, you probably see this advertisement somewhere on social media. This is an app for busy professionals. So if you don't have a time to read, please, read this app. You're going to finish this thick book in 15 minutes or less. Have you seen those? Right? Those apps that they're like, okay, here's if you're too busy, here's like bottom line of this book. I have a problem with that actually. I know it might be useful, but I feel like you cannot really experience like Shakespeare through the Coles notes. It's kind of like that, right? So it's the bottom line in culture, maybe. So I thought about it. So then obviously I Googled bottom lining. And this is what I actually found on Google. So I hope some of you actually can identify with this. For example, there's a bottom lining of movies. And Lord of the Rings, this like 9-hour like epic movie I watch every Christmas. Okay, 9 hours long. That's my tradition. And then people ask, how would you actually bottom line this movie? And how would you do that? And I love this person who said, it's like a group spends 9 hours returning jewelry. And well, it's kind of true, but it's not really. But then I was laughing at it because there's a whole series of this, online. And Harry Potter, for example, how would you bottom line this movie? Like maybe you haven't watched the movie, but you know the storyline. And then surprisingly, they said, well, it's about a boy spending 7 years being a third wheel. I don't know which boy is a third wheel, but anyway, this is a very interesting perspective, isn't it? So, and I thought this is hilarious how sometimes bottom lining really is like your perspective. And this movie, some of you may have watched, and this actually gave me nightmares for a few nights. The movie The Shining. And for those of you who watched it, how would you bottom line this movie? And somebody said, a family's first Airbnb experience goes very wrong. And this is actually a joke series called Explain a Film Plot Badly. And I was laughing at the same time. I'm thinking, this is kind of like pretty scarily true for many of bottom lining that we actually do, because there's quite a bit of things missing when you bottom line things. So, one of the things that I want you to know is that other than I live with three other people and a dog, I'm a scientist. I'm a communication scientist. And I say that very intentionally because there's this thing about science that we misunderstand and don't understand. And then because somebody asked me about, so why do you think it's the case? I thought about what we mean by science and see if I can actually bottom line it. So if you can actually bottom line the entire field of science, what would you say? Interesting, huh? So I thought about it really for days. And science, if you were to ask me to bottom line, I will bottom line it this way. If you do this, then that happens. And this happens whether you are looking at chemistry. Like if you actually mix this drug with that drug, this happens. If it happens in physics, if you do this angle, then this happens. If you actually mix this one with this one, this will blow up. Or this happens in biology too. It happens in environmental science. It happens in many different science that if you do this, then that happens. It almost sounds like cause and effect, but it's actually also correlational. If you do this, then this seems to happen. Interesting. So people actually sit and actually look for some of those things happen. So a very simple bottom lining of science, what we do in science, and I'm sure some scientists are listening to this, and I hope that you can agree roughly to this statement. Bottom line, if you do this, then this happens. And this very simple sentence actually sort of shows us that certain things that happen are in interactions are conditional. Here's a condition, then that happens. Second one is functional. There's something, there's a condition and it functions in a certain way. And then the third one is observable. So if you do this, then that happens. And usually the conclusion in science is, so this is how we know that. So it's something that we can observe. If you do this, then that happens, and here's how we know. This is kind of like what we do in science. Then what do we mean by communication science? In communication science, we do very similar things. If you do this, then that happens. So what is it that you do in communication? And what does that do to your communication? So these are the two main, I guess, observations that we are going to make today. What do you do and what does that do? Now, remember the topic today is how to listen, not how to talk. So how to listen so that they will talk. So then what do we mean by if you do this? What do you mean? What does a listener do? And then what does that listening do? And those are the two main topics we'll talk about. Hopefully, you are intrigued by this topic as much as I am. Now, here's a little tiny narrative. And, I find it funny that this is an excerpt from a book chapter. And actually, the reference of the book chapter is actually longer than the excerpt itself. So I find it fascinating. But anyway, so here's an excerpt. And I want you to remember the person's name that you wrote down as somebody that you would love to be a better listener to, whether it's your spouse, family, friend. And as you're thinking about that person, I want you to put this context in their life. So let's suppose that they are saying this to you. So they say, well, I've been struggling with it for some time, and I really want to see some positive changes. But I find myself going back to my old habits. I know I can't do it. And others seem to think that too. But for some reason, I don't seem to be able to move forward as much as I want to. Now, the ones that are underlined is some things that you can actually replace with their context. So I've been struggling with it. Could be smoking, writing a thesis, could be, oh, my relationship with so-and-so. So it can be replaced with their context. And I really want to see some positive changes, they say. And that positive changes, it could be contextualized. What are they usually saying is, oh man, I wish this would actually happen. And then they say, I find myself, but you know what? I find myself going back to like this old pattern, like it keeps on happening. What are they saying about their old habits? And I know I can do it. So the underlying ones, I want you to really think from what they usually say when they talk to you about something, okay? So these are some contexts that I can actually give you. Before we get to a little bit of a very simple tool based on research, and specifically communication research using microanalysis of face-to-face dialogue. And now it's becoming interesting because now we have a lot of online conversation, Zoom conversation. It's face-to-face, but not really. But let's say what we do. So this is the narrative I want you to kind of think about in the back of your mind. This is the narrative you hear from that person. So when they talk, there's a timeline in their storyline. So when you think about what you just heard or what people tell you, here's a timeline from past to future. And, actually, before we go there, I want you to think about usually how you respond to that person. When you hear the person say something like this to you, actually, what do you say in response? Like if you were in a conversation with this person and they say this, what do you say in response usually? And think about that. And especially like sort of make a note of a few words that pop to you or something that you're like, yeah, this is how I think I'm going to actually respond. And it's interesting because then that's what you do. And let's look at what that does. But anyway, here's a timeline in your storyline. When people talk, they're telling you something that happened in the past, something that might happen in the future. And there's a little elusive room called now. Now is like the time that you and I have together, this particular interaction that we are having. And, when you put this particular narrative on this timeline, it's pretty easy to do, right? Because it's like, oh yeah, I've been struggling. That's kind of like past leading up to now. I really want to see some positive changes, that's kind of like in the future. But I find myself going back to my old habits. Now it's past. I know I can do it. Now, this is a little bit of a tricky one, isn't it? Is it past? Is it future? So it's kind of like borderline. And other people seem to think that too. It's like, yeah, I've seen other people thinking that I can do it. So it's closer to the past. But for some reason, I don't seem to be able to move forward as much as I want to. Interesting. Where would you put that? Well, I don't seem to be able to move forward. Now, I don't seem to be. It's kind of like, yeah, I notice that I am not able to, but it's also kind of like the now. But moving forward piece is what they want for their future. So feel free to actually, kind of respond to this in the chat box. And they say, well, as much as I want to, I'm not really moving forward. So kind of past future is a little bit straightforward. Huh? Now then, here is another one that is happening. When you are having a conversation with people, usually they have this past future, but also they have preference. They are telling you in their content, this is what I would like to see happening more, and this is what I want to see happen less. So they talk about their preference. So when you hear this narrative, I've been struggling with it for some time. Is the struggle that they want more or less? Interesting, isn't it? Whatever the it is, it may be actually different for each person that you thought about. I've been struggling with quitting smoking for some time. Do they want to smoke? No, it's clear. Well, I've been thinking about these negative patterns of thoughts for some time. Negative thoughts, they want it less. Well, I've been struggling with, making my relationship better with my parents. Okay, making my relationship better, that's what they want more. So, depending on how you defined it, it might be either something that they want or they don't want. And then they say, I really want to see some positive changes. This is kind of safe. It's safer than the first one. We know that they said they want to see it so that we can safely put that in. This is what they want. Okay. But then I find myself going back to my old habits. Well, when you put it this way in a sentence, it sounds like, well, you don't want that old habits. So that's probably something that you want less, isn't it? So you can actually analyze a very short narrative like this. And I know I can do it, and other people seem to think that too. But for some reason, I don't seem to be able to move forward. They want to move forward, don't they? So this is how you actually look at some of these things. Let me actually see some of your comments. I love this. Look at that. Okay, cool. Thank you for actually helping with this. Pick somebody in your life who would be a good for you. That's great, Debbie. Thank you. And then, so when you actually put that together, there's a positive content and negative content and past future. We called what you want more as positive content. And this is actually the term that comes from the research tradition of microanalysis. So when people seem to talk about what they want, we call it positive content. And what they talk about, then we call it negative content. And there are 4 areas on this map. You see that? It's 1, 2, 3, 4. And going from first one, which is upper right, in case you cannot see the screen, and upper right is, so arrow goes from left to right, past to future, top to bottom, positive content to negative content. And when you actually put that together, you have a quadrant. And the first quadrant is upper right, which is positive content of the future. Upper left is positive content from their past. And bottom left would be negative content from their past. And bottom right is the negative content of their future. And each quadrant actually has a name. We call quadrant number 1 something that they really would like to see happening more, which is preferred future. And something that they want to see, they actually saw that happen, that they would love to see more happening from their past, is called resourceful past. And then number 3, oh man, this happened. I really didn't enjoy it. Whether it's interaction, experiences, feelings, like conversations, it's like, oh man, that really didn't go well. We call that either troubled past, regretful past, in some cases, traumatic past. And then the very last one is something that you're thinking, you're anxious about, you're nervous about it. And it's something we call fearful future or dreaded future. Now, when you look at the same narrative, put them together, how would you actually map it on that map? And by the way, this map actually also has a name. It's Dialogic Orientation Quadrant. It's a big name. And this is actually excerpt and the concept from the textbook. And this is a chapter that I have written. So this is like excerpt that's very short, maybe like 4 sentences. But how do you map it on this quadrant? And it's not as hard as you actually think it is. What belongs to quadrant 1, do you think? What information out of all these things that they say belong to quadrant 1? Also think about what kind of information that they actually say. Now, not inferring the information that they didn't say, but based on what you actually hear the person say, what did they actually say that they really want to see happen in the future, that they don't want to see in the future, that they really liked in the past, and they also like to see, they really didn't enjoy in the past. Can you see it, right? You see the little bit of that. They want to make changes, right, Rosario? And you say sentence 2 is like, quadrant 3, quadrant 1. I know I can do it, right? It's so funny that now you see the map, you can sort of like kind of do that. And it's roughly put, it can be this way. I've been struggling. Quadrant 3. I really want to see some positive changes. As some of you said, it's 1. I find myself going back to my old habits. Quadrant 3. I know I can do it. It's like, is it like 1 or 2? Exactly. So it's 1 or 2. And others seem to think about that too. And that's 1 or 2 as well. But for some reason, whatever the reason might be, and what's interesting is oftentimes when we hear this, I don't know what you actually mentioned as your immediate response to it, but many times people say, so what's actually getting in the way? Isn't that funny? We ask people because they say for some reason, so what's getting in the way? And then I don't seem to be able to move forward as much as I want to. So this is a very quick mapping of 5 sentences right here. Then, we need to think about, but why are we doing this? Because this is a listening map, even though it has a very fancy name, it's a listening map. So when you listen to people talk, this is a very rough mapping. Now, here's a question. Which direction do you think is a very useful direction? If you're thinking maybe your teenagers or maybe your friends or maybe your parents, colleagues, which part of this narrative do you think might be attractive for them to actually talk more about? Okay, think about that because you have many options right now because what you say next will do something to your conversation. So when you put it this way, here's something that's interesting that happened when you are having conversations with people. They're really all of the map, aren't they? But then there are certain things that we do that actually has this kind of movement. So somehow we are actually getting them to sort of get out of their 3 or 4 and go into 1 and 2. Some people mentioned that, what do we do when somebody actually just does not get out of the complaining and they're too anxious about something? How do I have that? How do I listen so that they will speak? This movement is called resource activation. But then also we do some other things very naturally that causes this kind of movement, which is what we call problem activation. When you're listening to somebody, depending on your perspective, you will be activating certain things. So sometimes when you're actually believing that this person is a problem, this person has a problem, or when somebody's telling you the story that same narrative that you see, and you're thinking, okay, what should I do? What can I do? How you should fix? So if you're addressing it from problem focused, problem identifying, or problem activating, that's what they're going to talk about probably a lot more because you ask for it. So what happens is naturally, take a guess. Naturally, when people come and sit down with you, which quadrant do you think people talk about more? One, two, three, four. Which ones do you think people naturally talk about? Just take a guess, like unprompted, and you're in a conversation. And think about this context too, like COVID times and all these things. And people naturally, I mean, what do you hear? What do you see on the media? And what do you hear around you? Right? And many of you are actually saying, yes, that's exactly what you hear. Because what happens is we have this thing called negativity bias, and we are more likely to actually talk about what's not working and what we are dreading because it has a very good value for our survival. So we talk about that. We call that negativity bias. And this is something that is happening very naturally. So it's not because you're a negative person. And the ratio is 3 to 1. People are 3 times more likely to talk about quadrant 3 or 4. And it's not because they are complainers, it's just because that's what people do. Same with you. And so many times people say, hey son, how do you actually, like, how do you manage to be, live in quadrant 1 or 2 all the time? And it's like, I really don't. My home is quadrant 4, right? And Michelle is saying, right now it's 4. And Catherine, that's Troy. Many of you are saying 3 or 4, and right now media is not helping, is it? And then Richard, you say 1 is so fascinating because 1 is where we like to talk a little bit more about. Even 2, like it's been almost like a year now. And how have you coped? And especially if you're living alone, if you are in a situation where you are not as independent as you used to be, how have you coped so far? Okay, some of you actually asked that question too. Like, how do you actually have that conversation about coping when somebody's really struggling with something? And that really depends on how you listen. Hmm? And Eve, you say, does it depend on the general mood or the person at the time? Possibly. But what's interesting is when people are happier, they tend to talk about happier things, and that also helps. So, I mean, there's a whole other theory about that too. But, our role as a listener is very specific. So, for example, we talked about this listening. If you do this, then that happens. Think about that. What do you think that we do when we listen? What does a listener do? And what does listening do? If you do this, then that happens. So, listening, what does a listener do? So, the part, if you do this, what is it that we do? Well, when you look at communication research, we do some things that are visible. And oftentimes, it has a, what do you call it? Mislabel. It's like body language. It's not a separate language. It's just it's all part of one communicative act. So there are some things that we do visibly, such as, I mean, many of you, like some of you might actually have a resting face that is different than how you intended to look. Yes. And what happens is visibly, you are doing some things. For example, as you're listening to somebody right now, you might be actually frowning, you might be smiling, you might be nodding. There are so many things that you do visibly. And we do these hand gestures, we do eye contact. So there are many visible gestures that we do, including facial gestures, nodding, hands. What about audible acts? We do something audibly. What are some things that we do? As you're listening to me, what am I doing? I'm talking. But when you're listening, sigh. Thank you. Yes, you sigh too. It's like, oh man, you sigh. And those audible things that we do, including words that we speak. And right, Margaret? You do that. And what's interesting is all these things that we do. Troy, interesting, you agree. And now the question is, how do you know that they agree, right? And Catherine says, I nod and listen in agreement, because nodding is one. I mean, for example, if I can see your faces, and if one of you actually looks slightly confused, then you know what that's going to do to me is I will take it as a cue to, okay, I need to clarify some things. So webinars are a little bit tricky sometimes because I don't see you, and we're talking about listening, and I'm talking nonstop at you. Isn't that interesting? So there are some visible things that you do, some audible things that you do. Then the question is, when you do them, what does that do? Does that make them talk more? Does that make them continue talking, or does that actually stop their speech? So, I'm going to actually sort of talk to you about this because this is the piece that I really think a lot of people misunderstand. When we say audible things that we do, oftentimes people say, well, listeners, they kind of ask questions. Well, that's one of them, especially in professions like coaching, therapy, and all those things. People focus so much on what we ask, but asking is not listening. And sometimes say, well, according to active listening, we're supposed to be like paraphrasing. That's great. We call that formulation. It's different than questioning. But you formulate. That just means based on what you just hear, you simply either respond by, oh, you mean this. So you're summarizing, you somehow keep what they say. Sometimes you also add to what they didn't say. So, sometimes when you actually, I remember this colleague of mine who didn't particularly like Mondays. And every Friday she will say, Happy Friday, or TGIF or something like that. Yes, it makes sense, TGIF. And I'm thinking, well, it's interesting people say that, but, I didn't particularly like Fridays because I loved my work. So every Monday I go to work very early and like 6 o'clock before anyone gets there. I get a lot of things done before everyone comes in around 8:39. And by that time is my coffee break because I'm pretty much done for the day. And she will just come in around 8:30, 8:45. And like, you can tell it's like Monday steps, right? And she comes in and like her office happened to be from the entrance all the way down the hallway. So she's passing by every single door on her way to her office. And she will actually, stop by my door. She looks at me and I'm having my coffee and she says, I know it's Monday. And I'm like, I don't know. I don't even know what that means. And she will look at me like, are you okay? You look tired. And, I was having a perfectly fine day until she says it. And the minute she says, you look tired, I'm like, do I look weird? Am I not wearing something right? And all of a sudden, what she says will start to impact my reality. That's what listening, speaking does to one another. That's what we call social construction. So, interestingly, people talk about we, as a listener, we ask questions. Yes, we do, but we are no longer kind of listening anymore, isn't it? When we're formulating, a lot of times people add their meaning to what you look like and what you sound like. So sometimes students actually come to me and say, hey, son, this client of mine was so resistant. And I said, I don't understand. And it's like, oh man, this person was like resisting everything that I said. And usually our sessions are video recorded. So I say, can you show me? Can you show me the segment that you will actually say this person was resisting? And, the person is actually playing this entire videotape. And what's so interesting is every time when the practitioner actually labeled the client as resisting is when you actually add your own words. You're feeding your words to what the client actually didn't say. So it's interesting to see how these interactions happen. But then what's really part of listening is what we do other than talking. We don't ask questions. We don't actually paraphrase or echo or any of those things. But what is it that we do? We do, as I think, was it Megan or Margaret actually who said, we do mm-hmm. But there are at least like 19 different mm-hms, right? As you listen to this narrative that I showed you, some of you might be like, if that person was sitting down with you, you might be like, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Or at some parts you're there, mm-hmm. When you look at the transcript, it's actually spelled M-H-M, Margaret. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Exactly same spelling, isn't it? But then what happens is that's a very specific listener response. Now going back to the quadrant, remember 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4 being the bottom. Guess where we do a lot of mm-hms? Like in a way that is really like portray our interest. 3 or 4. Not only people talk about 3 or 4, but you also show so much interest in 3 or 4. It's like, wow, And then you know what that does to the conversation? They continue talking about that, whatever it is that you show interest to. Somebody said, well, I've been struggling with it for some time. Especially if you think you know what they're struggling with, you're like, and then they will tell you more about that. And they say, I really want to see some positive changes. Instead of doing you're like, it's interesting how a small gesture like can really influence the other person's speech. And that's what we mean by how we listen will actually influence how they talk. So one of the things that I really would like to actually ask you to think about is this. The person that you identified as the person that you would like to have a better conversation with, especially around you want to listen better so that they will talk to you more. Think about it this way. Probably they tell you a few things from their quadrant 3 or quadrant 4. Maybe something that is working well, but here's my barrier, here's something that's not working well. Think about where you actually show a lot of interest. You might be even asking for it. You might be like, tell me about the barrier. How come you're not moving forward? What's getting in the way? When you do that, what are you exploring here? You're exploring what is not working. But there are a lot of things that you could have actually chosen from that narrative too. So if you think about it, many times we hear people talk, especially 3 times more in quadrant 3 or 4, but your listening makes a difference. For example, I want you to think about that person's narrative, and I'm going to ask one simple question for you to think about. In their typical narrative, whether it's your spouse, colleague, your child, friend, what are they actually telling you that they care about? I have a friend who vents a lot, and it's hard for me because I've known her for 15 years, and she always vented. And it's always hard for me to actually sort of set my mindset and listen to what is she telling me that she really values? Because it's so much easier for me to actually evaluate what she's saying as a complaint, don't we? Do you have a complainer in your life? I mean, I'm sure you do. If not, then probably you are the one complaining a lot. But when you think about their complaints, we hear complaining because we think they are complaining. And that's the filter that we have. And there are a lot of filters that we have, especially if you think you know them. The closer relationship, the longer years of relationship you've had, probably you think that you know their stories. So you sort of stop listening. So, I would love to actually open it up for, many of you to kind of like ask questions and so on so feel free to, as you are engaging, I love how you're actually engaging here. And there are so many other things around, how we use our gazes and so on and so forth, based on research. But really, this little thing about listening is so underrepresented that we are always, kind of like asked to like, we are trained to ask questions, but then, we're not really trained to listen. And the question is, what are we listening to? What are we listening for? And if you listen to every single complaint as if they're actually telling you something that they care about, very likely they will speak to you about something. If you have this filter, not only that, we have our own filters when we listen, but they also have their filters too. And their filter is usually, especially think about your children. When you speak to them, they might have this habit of mind, that actually they probably picked up along the way, that you're trying to teach them or you're trying to control them. That's something that they might have in their filter, and they're not going to listen to you, right? But then also same with you, you have certain filters or bottom line of the person. When you think of somebody, you have a bottom line of their storyline or their character, you somehow have like some very succinct summary, like Lord of the Rings being groups taking 9 hours to return jewelry. And many times it may be true, but not entirely true. And when that actually comes into play in your interaction with them, it gets in the way, right? So, let me actually look at some of the things here, how you are. By the way, if you have an idea, as you're saying, Tiana, here, that there's sort of like, oh, wow, I'm going to actually try this next time, please share that, because and Tiana, I really resonate with you, because when I'm telling you this in 40 minutes, 8,000 hours of watching those videos and studying, that people are so intrigued about quadrant 3 and 4 of other people. And that's very natural for us. That's why we have this intentional process and practice of how do we actually turn the conversation so that we are really listening to what they care about. And simply out of that same narrative that I just showed you, you have at least about 10 different ways of responding to them. You can say, wow, so you've thought about a lot about this positive change that you want to see. Tell me more about that. It's one option. Another option is, yeah, I noticed that you keep going back to your old habit. What's going on? Tell me more about that. The simple phrase of tell me more. Please bottom line your life for me, but if you do not frame it, well, it sounds like you've thought a lot about this positive changes. Tell me more about that. Versus, yeah, you keep on like, somehow you keep on going back to that old habit. You just can't get out of it. Tell me more about that. That's a two very different tell me more, isn't it? And what you're listening for will either transform, well, it will transform their meaning either to this way or that way, activating their resources, activating their problems. So here's a bottom line for you. When you thought about that person that you thought, wow, that person is a great listener, what do they seem to bottom line for you? Resources or problems? They probably somehow reminded you of your own resources, strength, and your own knowledge of competence and confidence. And that's why you probably talked more. And those are it's not a hard skill, but it's simple, but it's not necessarily easy. It comes with the practice. So, often, the assignment or homework that I would like to actually pose to people is this. Think about somebody that you want to sit with and listen to for about 3 minutes. And especially as they get into their typical narrative, just take 10 seconds to think about, what did they just tell you that they care about? And then start your next sentence with, so you seem to really care about this, and fill in the blank. And if they say, yeah, I guess I do, or they might be like, whatever, then you simply pose the next question of, why is that so important to you? And when you can actually have a conversation that's orienting to quadrant 1 or 2, there's a much better chance that they're going to actually want to talk to you. Okay. So my goodness, all these questions, this is so cool. And, thank you so much for like really engaging in this conversation with one another, and you're talking to one another. And as you're saying that this is kind of like very simple. And Joanne, I'm appreciating that you love this. And the reason is because you can have this kind of conversation, and you can teach this teach this to your family. Just take out a napkin and draw it. It's not too hard. And then really, and I do this when I do consulting, I go to a company and team consulting, team coaching, and simply do this mapping and say, hey, what are we actually, what's our speech pattern in our team meetings? And then they just simply do that, map themselves, and they're so astonished. It's like, oh my gosh, we're so in 3 or 4. But actually in company level, it's a good thing to do, because quadrant 4 is, we call it risk management, right? But then really think about your strategic conversations at work, or your relational sort of connecting with your loved ones. It really is about, where are you getting people to orient their attention to? the more they can orient their attention to quadrant 2 or quadrant 1, they're more likely, talk to you more about it because they feel safer, they feel more competent and confident as they talk to you about it, right? My goodness, this is so interesting that you are coming from so many different like background. Michelle says, as a physicist, I love this. Isn't it true? Actually, as a physicist, as anybody who actually went through schooling, especially in North America, you can actually tell that we are very good at problem solving. I mean, isn't McMaster actually known for problem-based learning? Hello, right? So here's a problem. How would you solve it? And it's an interesting idea that we hear to other people's story as if it's a problem to solve. And I think a lot of times that actually shuts other people down because they're not a problem to solve, nor they have a problem that they need to now solve, but they're telling you something that they care about. And, in closing, I'm going to actually pose a story that I hope that you will resonate with, because at my address, conversations happen around grief with my mom, myself, about growth, like with the kids. And the other day, Nathan, the 11-year-old, actually turned to me. I was boiling water. He's like just, like getting some, water for his glass. And he just turned to me and he said, "Auntie, do you like watching us grow?" And that really moved me for some reason, because I realized that there is something that he is noticing every day that is giving him that idea. So then I actually dropped everything I was doing and I said, wow, what a great question. And I would love to hear about, what you're thinking, like what's behind that question. I love that. And I actually sat down and listened. And, my initial interpretation was like, yeah, like you appreciate me. But actually, as I listened to him, I didn't know what was hurting him. I didn't know that, he was thinking certain things. And he actually wanted to ask me to check. He said, do you actually enjoy, like, do you like watching us grow? And that little opening ended up being like 3-hour conversation with this 11-year-old. And those openings are everywhere. I see that opening with my mom who's grieving every day. And now there's a pressure socially to get over it. I mean, you can't just get over it. You can get through it each time that happens. So some of you might be going through grief. Some of you might be struggling with having kids at home 24/7. Maybe some of you are working from home like I am, full time. And you have a barking dog, who knows, or the cat that's walking on your desk, who knows. But then remember, there's always that opening. So interestingly enough, some of your questions are about how you can speak, and how you speak or what you speak always comes from what you hear that they care about. If you especially preserve what they say, then they're not going to say, well, that's not what I said, because that's what they said. That you preserve and say, wow, you really care about this. And they'll be like, yes, I do. And that's the basis for opening. Actually, one other thing, somebody actually asked when they were registering, they asked this question of, what is a very good opener for a conversation? Here's the thing, I don't do small talk stuff. So one of the things that I actually enjoy about having to be at home is I don't have to attend weddings. So, I mean, weddings I didn't really enjoy because you go and have a bunch of small talk and talk about your purse and shoes. So, one of the things that I used to do when I was invited to weddings is like simply start your conversation by, so what do you care about? And then usually the table goes kind of quiet because it's kind of heavy. But that's my favorite way of actually beginning my conversation. What do you care about? Or sometimes even when I do interviews, I simply ask them, hey, what would be good for me to learn about you? Isn't that cool? So thank you so much for joining, all of you. And thank you for joining Francesca. And, all of you, I really hope that you do something with it. If there's one thing, please draw this little quadrant and use it in your next listening. When you're on the phone, when you're Zooming, having to listen to that person that you have a hard time listening to, your children. See if you can actually do this quadrant. And I think you're gonna really love this. So thank you so much for joining, and hopefully, you will use it. And let me know how you use it. I love those stories when you use it.